I would love today to begin by sharing a little bit of a personal story, followed by an observation at the department from the last few weeks of some phone calls and emails I've received. And then I would love to share with you some current data about students with autism and students with disabilities in California because, as Ann shared, we really need to know where we are, what our baseline is, in order for us to seek improvement. So I would also be remiss if I didn't mention that Liz Zastro and the Transition Community of Practice would hold me incredibly accountable if I did not share that we are mapping to employment for individuals with disabilities in California. And this is very personal for me, and this is where I sort of break into my little mini personal story, if you'll allow me. I have a daughter who's 19, as many of you know, and she is an amazing individual who is nonverbal and has a multitude of physical and developmental and sensory disabilities. And as some of you also know, she spent the first 12 years of her life in home hospital in our garage. And we had a myriad of professionals come. We had an incredible program. You know, I was, to my own profession, queen of getting services, right? Because that's what we need to get when we're parents. We have to get the most services and the most hours because that's what's going to help. And reflecting now, and at that point in time, for those first 12 years, I didn't know to map to employment. We were just trying to get through the day. We were hoping she wasn't going to cry or have behaviors. And so we were just in the minute. And the idea of employment was so far away from my thinking because of the day-to-day activities. I didn't look to what it would take when she was out of school to be able to have all the skills that she needed to be out in the community. And so now that she's 19 and I have been enlightened, we are, and we have been for the last few years, on a relentless pursuit of making up time of those things that are the barriers to her being out to be able to have employment in our community. So recently, we started working with an employment agency, one of the local ones in our community. And their job is to really bridge, you know, what types of jobs are we going to prepare my daughter for? Well, we know that in order for anyone to discover what someone wants to know, they have to be able to communicate what they know. And really, that's been one of the largest challenges for a child who's nonverbal and also has physical challenges, is getting that communication in place. And in retrospect, had I understood what communicative competence was, I would have been in relentless pursuit for her to have that be the #1 priority of our life. And so many of the things that resulted from the behaviors and from the barriers throughout the first 12 years were really a result of a lack of communication. And for many of you who know me know that communicative competence is like one of the, I make sure I say it 20 times in every single time I talk to anyone. Because we know, as a group, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, that that is such a critical piece to the puzzle. So fast forward over the last few years, we've put in place much more communication. We started with PECs, we moved to picture cards, then we had very low-tech devices. Now we have an iPad. But through the discovery of what we learned about her, we discovered that she wasn't a static 6 choices kind of gal. She was a 5-layer kind of gal who really wanted to say much more than we gave her the opportunity to say. So fast forward to this past year where she has been really started to tell us what types of things she really likes to do in sentences when she's going 2 or 3 layers deep to find that right communication symbol. We learned that her best days are filled with music. That's what she wants. She wants to be with people. She wants to not be at home, which is kind of ironic considering we held her prisoner there for 12 years. So through that, we have seen a massive decrease in behaviors, in pinching, in teeth grinding, in all the kinds of behaviors that she was trying to use to communicate that she needed more than 6 pictures and yes and no to communicate. Fast forward to this past week, where she has, over the past few months, started to work with the agency. She's been pushed to be with more new people, to go out. She's been pushed to answer a lot of questions about what does she like and want, and how would she even know what that is. And so this week, she's a girl that's on a schedule, right? And for many children with sensory issues, that schedule is golden. You stay on that schedule, they know the schedule, you try to get off the schedule, and everything goes awry. So it's been long days for her. And as her communication has unlocked, her understanding that she has choices has also unlocked. And so for the last 3 nights, she goes through a routine when she gets home from doing community activities about 7 o'clock, because she does not want to be home before 7 o'clock. And she goes on the computer for a while. She goes in the spa with my husband. She comes back to the computer. She goes to watch a show in our room for a transition, and then she goes into her room to go to sleep. Well, she's decided that that's not her routine anymore. Her routine now is, she's had a long day, she comes in, she watches the computer, she goes in the spa, and then she puts herself to bed. Now, if you knew her, you would be astounded that that is a decision that she would make. But the fact that she understands that she has the right to make that decision, that's a new world. And I tell you this because, and it does choke me up, because for all of our kids, we want them to know that they have choices. And that back mapping that we're doing as parents to employment and to having successful lives in our community is what's going to empower us to demand communication and acceptance and compassion and understanding by everyone in our community. So I hope you don't mind that I sort of deterred from my original talk for a minute to share that, but I think it applies to this so well because that's why we're all here. We're trying to make and create those community members that are empowered to make choices about their lives. And now we have a system that supports them on the other end. And that's new. And the conversations that I know you've had before with about transition and with our partners with Department of Rehab and Department of Developmental Services and EDD, we've put in place that expectation. So the second piece I wanted to share with you was some interesting calls and emails I've received from a variety of people over the last few weeks. And the most recent one was an email I received that asked the question of whether or not, and I get these questions a lot, does the law say we really have to allow kids with disabilities in certain things? After school programs, general ed classrooms? Like, does the law really say that we have to? And I'm always struck by thinking, are you really asking that question? Yes, the law does support that you have to, because these are people and we're all created equal and we all have the right to a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive or most inclusive environment. And that does include after school. That includes the programming that all other kids get. So it made me start thinking, and I was talking to Lorraine in the car, and I said, does this make sense? So it almost seems like we really have to move away from if, those questions about if we can, and really start asking how we can. And that until we move away from if and asking the questions on whether someone can belong, whether they're legally required to, and really just about how are we going to ensure that all kids have all the same opportunities. And so part of the work that we're doing and part of the reason that I'm here and that I took this position was because I really felt a shift in the landscape around the will to create environments that are accessible from the build with the intention, with the intention that everyone does belong. And using the vehicle of the IEP to the greatest extent possible. So if we have those environments that are created with universal design principles in mind, including programming, right? Whether that's CTE or any other type of programming after school, expanded learning programs, whatever it is. And then we empower our IEP teams to get creative. So the question is not any longer if they can come, if they're allowed, if it's possible, but it's really how are we going to make that happen if that's what the IEP team determines is the best thing for that child. So as we start to talk about where we are and how we move the needle for our students with disabilities in California as well as our students with autism, I think it's good to set sort of a foundation. So this is actually in education code. Some of you have seen me present this before, but I'm overusing this slide. And the exciting thing is now all my colleagues at the department in every other division are also using this slide. And so we're not just talking about students with disabilities, we're talking about every student in California. Everyone's unique, everyone's special, everyone has unique needs. Today we're talking about students with disabilities, but in California, our education system in law says that each child is a unique person with unique needs, and the purpose of the education system of this state is to enable each child to develop all or his own potential. I love having that as a foundation, because that allows us to have whatever conversations we need to have around equity and access to level the playing field. You all know the backdrop of the IDEA. It's a critical backdrop for us because it's what we bump up against. When someone calls me and says, do we have to? I can say, yes, we do. Look at federal law says we have to. But you know what? Let's also do it because it's the right thing to do and because we care about all kids, not because just the law is gonna be mad if we don't do this. The other piece is really the parent piece. And this is a piece where, although I was a very empowered parent and I was my CAC chair and did all the things that a parent should do, I was not fully empowered because I did not have enough information that I needed. It's taken me 15 years as a parent to finally sort of understand all the dynamics. That's too long. So our parents are our critical voice, and like I talked about earlier, if I'm spending all my energy trying to get services, I'm missing the point. So one of the other backdrops to this whole conversation about special education has been the work of the Special Ed Task Force. And I bring that up because it is still what our policymakers are mapping to. Our governor, our state board, and other policymakers keep going back to the Special Education Task Force recommendations and sort of measuring themselves and saying, are we doing what the task force said we should do? So if you haven't taken a look at that, I recommend you just take a look. There's an executive summary online. But basically, they called for one unified, coherent system of education supporting all students, the need for all educators to be prepared to work effectively with all students, and a statewide commitment to serve all students, recognizing that every student is a general ed student first. So we are working really hard in the department, and I would love your support in your districts and county offices around this, which is to not refer to students as special ed students anymore. Students are students, and special education is a support and service. It is not a label, it's not a place. It is support and service that any student that is qualified and needs services can have. That paradigm change causes pause for a lot of our general educators, because traditionally we've had, as special educators, we've had the SPED students, the SPED kiddos, the special ed students, right? And once we do that, we have segregated them on our own. unintentionally. And so I've been working really hard, and my colleagues in the department have been working really hard to really use people first language and take out the word special education student off of the labels, off of our data, and other things. Another exciting thing that's been happening, and I really ask you to tune into this because it's going to be critical, is the Commission on Teacher Credentialing is planning on changing the Ed Specialist credential at their next meeting. It's big. So they should be publishing their agenda with a whole entire item on recommendations that the staff at the CTC is making to the commission, who will hear it and decide what happens with the Ed Specialist credential moving forward. I highly recommend you tune into it. You write letters about it if you have a feeling about it, or if you have a really big feeling about it, you show up and tell them. There are very few people who come to that meeting. There's a set of commissioners who solely make those decisions. Those decisions are not made by the CDE. We consult with them and give them our opinion, but the commission is an autonomous body. So I recommend you check that out if you can. The exciting thing about it is there is great talk about having a common trunk of preparation for general ed and special ed teachers, and then the tree trunk would branch off into branches of specialty, whether that be multiple subject, single subject, or special ed. We all know that collaboration for teachers early on is super critical in setting the foundation of how teachers work together later. So we have a number of universities that are already doing that work, that have already sort of combined their general and special ed programs for preparation. And some of those are being used as models. Cal State Long Beach is one of them. So let's look a little bit at the data. So here's where we are with autism in California. We're at, this one says 13.96%, but I saw another, oh, yeah, that's right. Obviously, we've seen an incredible rise in autism as a disability category. We've also seen a decline among some of the other disability categories. So currently in the state, 11% of our student population has an IEP. That's a lot of kids. 754,000 of our students with disabilities could fill 7 of the largest football stadiums in the United States. Nearly half are between the ages of 6 and 12. We're overwhelmingly male represented. Our English learners comprise 29% of that population. And the top 3 disability categories currently are specific learning disability, speech and language, and now autism. Here's what the numbers look like. This is for primary or secondary disability. We added them together because it seemed like a better representation. So you'll see the increase is almost doubled since 2010. For the newest numbers, that 14.65% of the total population, that's primary and secondary disability for autism. That's why that's different than that first number. So here's the prevalence, looking at it in bar graph, just to give you an idea. And let's cut the data a little bit and look at, we're going to show you some slides, or I'm going to show you some slides of students with disabilities overall, and then you can see students with disabilities that have the autism disability category. The reason I'm showing those comparisons is we like to look to see if there's any disproportionality or under or over representation within any particular disability category, because I think that's how we start to think about what to do with our students. So by age, the majority are between 6 and 12. Of our students with disabilities, in general, 68% are male, 32% are female. However, if you look at autism, see that difference, that jump? We have 68% in the general population of kids with disabilities, 83% for kids with autism by gender. This is another interesting one. For race and ethnicity, this is students with disabilities overall. So we look at 56% Hispanic Latino, which is fairly consistent with the state average, or the state numbers. Underrepresented, Hispanic Latino population is underrepresented in autism, and the white Caucasian population is overrepresented compared to the numbers. Let's go back. Here's the general population for kids with disabilities and students with autism. So one of the things, we collect many things in terms of data points. One of the things that we thought you might find interesting is just the related services. So this is the overall related services for kids with disabilities. So just check out those top 3. And then here's students with autism, a little bit different. And you can have more than one related service, so this isn't just, so if you look at the numbers and you're like, why are there so many, it doesn't add up. It's because some kids have multiple services. So one of the things that there's been a lot of discussion about is placement for students with disabilities, and particularly students with autism. And as a state, we are 46th in the nation with the lowest percentage of kids spending 80% or more of their time in general ed. So our least restrictive environment data show that our students in California spend some of the least amount of time in general ed in the United States. That's a very upsetting number for me. I don't know about you. And so as we look at how we want our communities to look, as we talk about mapping to employment and expecting our students with disabilities to be in jobs in the communities, and then we look at the fact that nearly half of them are spending most of their time in segregated classrooms, doesn't really seem to match. That's one of those areas of improvement. So here's our students with disabilities overall. So public day school is your regular school, your local community school. You do see a difference in terms of the non-public. So for the general population of students with disabilities, 1.52% are in non-public schools. For students with autism, 4.35% are in non-public schools. Another potential talking point for you and your districts is around students with disabilities and where they sit within the local control funding formula. And I know so many of you in your districts are probably have either had input or want to have input to your local control accountability plans, right? That's the mechanism that we talk about how districts are going to improve. Here's a stat for you. 223 LEAs in the dashboard were identified for differentiated assistance, meaning they were red, right? Of those, 168 of them were for the students with disability subgroup alone. So never before has the flashlight been shined so brightly on our student population, but the question becomes, what do you do about that? And so what we've been advocating on the state side is we don't want those 168 districts to be sent to special ed land. We don't want those districts to say, well, special ed needs to fix themselves so we can get out of the dashboard. We have a commitment from all of our policymakers, our state board, our leadership, that those conversations that are happening in county offices and districts really should be about collectively, how are we looking at our most vulnerable populations, our canary in the coal mine, to say, what do we need to do differently in order to serve all of our students? And here's an indication that our most vulnerable students are really not succeeding. So the all hands on deck at the state level is new. This idea that it's not, these 160 districts are not being sent to the special ed division to be put in a status. That differentiated assistance, that bigger accountability system, that is not our monitoring. That is separate. That is the larger system finally taking accountability for a set of students who have classically underperformed. That to me is exciting, as disturbing as it is to see the dashboard the way it is. So those conversations about students with disabilities, taking the resources, having the LCAP written about them, this slide really is to show you that, and everyone, that students with disabilities are our other subgroups. That intersectionality between all those, that's real. And what we see in all these groups is that what we'd expect to see, so if you look at, it says all students, that's all students with disabilities in California. 11% of them are students with disabilities of all students. We expect to see that same proportion across the other subgroups. So English learners, if they were not disproportionate, would be 11% of English learners. We don't expect to see higher numbers based on a subgroup. So what this tells us is we have some work to do. And it also tells us that our students are many things. So of our students with disabilities, of those 754,000 students, 70% of them are in one or more of the LCFF subgroups. So it's the same people. So that conversation about being able to work with your Title I folks, your EL folks, y'all have the same kids. And so we really do have a ticket into that conversation, that LCAP, local control funding formula conversation. That's our ticket. And so in your own districts, being able to cut your own data, to be able to see your overlaps, and even dig deeper if you're talking about your students with autism, what are those overlaps and where are they represented in these other numbers so that you can have those collaborative conversations? So I believe most of you know what the local control accountability plan is. Yes? I won't belabor this, but this is really the tool. So once this November, when everyone was illuminated in the dashboard and you saw those big red, orange, yellow, green buttons, that's supposed to spark a conversation in districts. That conversation is supposed to lead to a revision of the LCAP. The LCAP can include students with disabilities. It's not forbidden that you can put students with disabilities and assisting that group of students in your LCAP. You can. And it's really designed to be a transparent document. It's measured according to 8 state priorities. You're going to start seeing, even on the Special Education Division webpage and our CalStat revision site, you're going to start seeing these 8 priorities so that as districts are doing improvement activities, it's in this vein. What do we need to do? Now we're front and center. Now we have everyone's attention. What is it that we're going to do collectively? The first thing is we're going to scale more train-the-trainer programs like Captain, because that is a mechanism that's working. And so kudos to all of you and your leadership for showcasing what's possible regionally. In the special ed division, we're also retooling ourselves. We have blown up sort of what we were doing before, and we are also working regionally in the Successa regions to be supporting each of our regions so that there's a clear understanding of who do you go to in the state, as are my other colleagues in my other divisions. So we need to know where we're aiming. You have the baseline data now, right? We know that there are a few tickets to success and to graduation. Our students with disabilities have a very low graduation rate. And many of our LEAs are in the red for graduation rate, along with suspension, expulsion, and assessment. We know those 3 areas are tightly correlated, right? And for many of our students, the baseline of that is really reading literacy and communication. So as a state, that is definitely one of the areas that we'll be focusing on, and I know you all are too. So being able to weave in those evidence-based practices so that our students with autism can get more access to the standards in our general ed environment is crucial. Back to the calls I've been getting. Many of those calls and emails are about students with autism. They're about the behaviors of students with autism in classrooms where we may not have trained general ed teachers to know what to do, and we may not have enough support in those classrooms to ensure that those students are getting the kind of support they need. The other piece to all of that is that our preschool inclusion rate is dreadfully low as well. So our students with autism and students with disabilities are not getting started in that trajectory. This year, the state budget and the governor have sent some more signals to us that they know this matters. $167 million of new dollars were allocated for early childhood and child care. Those slots, not those slots, but the funding is supposed to be going towards inclusive environments for children in preschool and state child care settings, state preschool. So those dollars will be competitive dollars that will be available over this next year. In addition, $100 million has been allocated for teacher preparation and retention of special educators. $50 million for innovation and $50 million for teacher residency. To me, those are massive signals. In addition, the governor has re-envisioned the funding around SELPA. So while all of the SELPA money was rolled into LCFF 3 or 4 years ago, the proposed budget states that we pull out that money and give it back to SELPA to base fund SELPA to be our regionalized experts, which I think is fantastic news. Yes. An additional $10 million of ongoing funds was also allocated in the budget for SELPA to work regionally with county offices around the system of support. So I feel like, in general, there is a movement towards this idea of support regionally, of training the trainers, of all the things that you all have already been doing around working with folks who are teaching kids with autism. So let's just talk really quickly. This is the data I mentioned about the least restrictive environment. These are California students with autism. We have a long way to go in terms of more inclusive practices. And I think I sense some sentiment out in the field, and I don't know if you would agree with this or not, that that ABA and other practices, evidence-based practices for students with autism have to occur in isolation all the time. And so I think we all have some work to do around training that students with autism do not have to be by themselves all the time, and that in order for us and for our community members, I was talking to Joe Xavier, the Department of Rehab director, who basically said, you know, the kids of today, the kids that are going into preschool now, are the employers of tomorrow. And if no one is together, and no one sees anyone, and no one understands how to work with people and what people's differences are, they become business owners, and they don't know. They really don't know. So here's also what I mentioned, and you can look at this later as well, but this is really about whether or not our students with autism are meeting the standards. 14%, people. We're looking at students who need to get jobs and fill out job applications, and we have 14% of our students who are meeting standards. And overall, our state is fairly low, but our students with disabilities are extremely low. And here's math levels even lower, 9% standards met. There does appear to be an underrepresentation of students with autism around suspension expulsion, which is a positive. Here are outcomes for students with disabilities and for students with autism in particular. I'd love to see it be a lot higher. And these numbers come from a sample that we receive as a state. Here's our exit reasons. Again, this is based on a 4-year cohort, and my hopes and dreams someday is that we'll be able to count a 5-year cohort graduation for our state accountability so that we can get a true idea for our students with disabilities. Would love your support around that. I probably shouldn't be saying that with the camera on, but I'll say it anyway. So again, our ultimate goal is to make working citizens who are participating in the community. We know that having a job is really the basis of how we all have our foundation and our place in the community. We have our families, yes, but we also need to have that community support. And why are we doing that? Because all of our students have potential and value, and it's foundational in our laws. It's foundational in our overall belief system as a nation. There shouldn't be except for. It should be everyone. And really, it's providing the tangibles and skills and outcomes. These are things that you all know. I know I'm preaching to the choir, and really encouraging that partnership and vision with multiple agencies. I see a huge commitment to wrapping our supports around students. It just needs to get to the tangible where you all feel like you know exactly what to do to bring those folks together. I know that is a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge for me as a parent, so I know we have a lot of work to do there. I don't think we get anywhere unless we really start changing the culture. And that starts in early intervention in preschool with those inclusive preschools. And really ensuring that children and families start and understand that from the moment you enter that K-12 system, that you're mapping to that job and that you have a group of people who are going to support you in that. And I know I'm beating the drum on the communicative competence, so I'll stop on that. But I see a big shift, and I know you all are doing that work around teaching, around supporting teachers and others. We have a huge state commitment around scaling multi-tiered system of support, which again is to our great state advantage. That work is still continuing. If you are in a district or county office that hasn't been involved around the scaling up multi-tiered system of support work out of Orange County, there's still one more cohort to join on to. And if there was a couple things that you could do to learn more about what's happening in the state, I highly recommend that you tune in to the Advisory Commission on Special Education. It's webcast, and it's the place where everyone comes to tell the Advisory Commission what is actually happening, and that is where state policy is accountable for special education. And so I think I see some of you have probably been there before. If you can tune into that, as well as the state board meetings when you see special ed items, that would be fantastic. One of the challenges we have in the disability community is that we're very quiet in education. Our voices are not being heard. And for any of you who have that, I know everyone's really busy, have that extra time to either show up or call or email, whether it's the Commission on Teacher Credentialing because you care about that, or any of the myriad of other things that are happening in the state, we really do need your voices. And I appreciate you taking the time to listen today, and I hope that you know that our doors at the department are always open should you have ideas, thoughts, complaints, or you want to come work there. Thank you.
Thank you.
You mentioned specific dollar amounts that were being allocated for different types of funding. Is there a place where we can find those dollar amounts to be able to share with our districts?
So if you go to, I can provide the link to Patty and Ann to send out, but if you go to the California state budget, there's like a synopsis document, that kind of an executive summary that will sort of tell you, and it's broken out into education because there's all the different categories, but education is one of them, and then you'll see actually those descriptions. And then there's 2 budget bills, one in the Senate and one in the Assembly. If you're really wonky and you want to really get into that 700-page document or whatever it is and look for the exact language, that's where you'll see the provisions that actually are affected. And as that starts working through the budget process, that's the governor's proposed budget, you'll see any kind of tweaks or changes happen to that language as it moves along.
We'll put the link to the budget up on through Facebook, and it's on page 26 if you want to know directly where to go.
In Head Start, there's income waivers. Is the state looking, currently there isn't an income waiver for state preschool, is for students who have disabilities. Is the state at least considering looking at an income waiver so that because currently, well, at least in our district, currently the special ed department, if a family is over income and the IEP team is recommending a state preschool spot, we pay that spot, which decreases the number of spots that the district really gets, and it becomes kind of politically dicey. So I'm hoping that there's going to be income waivers, just like Head Start.
Thank you. We have also made those suggestions, and agree. And I think there might be some language in the last set of slots that didn't allow that. Okay, so we will pay extra special attention to this language for the next $167 million. And maybe if you could provide Lorraine your contact information on my staff, we can make sure just to talk to you about what that exact issue is. Okay?
I love that you guys are going to be allocating more money to preschool. I think that's so important. We see a lot of kids who get identified as having autism, and if they can't get into a special preschool, they get speech for 20 minutes a week if their parents can take them. But a problem that we have run into many times is state preschools saying they have to be potty trained, which is also a really big problem for our kids with autism at that age. So I really hope that that's something you guys can take into consideration. I believe that to be illegal, yet it is very prominent. It's a big issue. We'll be like, they need to go to preschool. They're like, oh, they're not potty trained. We're like, okay, speech for 20 minutes.
Yeah, and I can comment on that now. That is not something, really the IEP team determines that placement's appropriate, and then the supports are in place, and the supports include toileting and potty if that child is not potty trained, because that would exclude a lot of kids forever. My daughter would never be able to go to any school if that was the case. So we're happy to talk to any of our district partners about how we can solve that issue. Not if they can go, but how they can go. Yeah.
And actually, I was just in an IEP yesterday when this came up. Communication is a huge deal. And with iPads and the communication tools that are coming up, it really does facilitate communication. I'm from a rural district. What we're running into is funding for these communication tools. And I did contact for low incidence funding, and they said it really doesn't fit that criteria. So I was wondering, is that going to become maybe a category that we can look at?
I can help you with that if you want to call me. We have experts at all 3 diagnostic centers about how to get funding for AAC and AT devices through the variety of sources and working together. So if you want to contact any of the 3 diagnostic centers, we have AAC experts on how to get funding.
And one of the benefits to that is to using alternate funding methods besides low incidence is that the device stays with the person. And so if it's paid through Medi-Cal or another mechanism that's outside of the school system, that's the child's device, not the district's device. So definitely hook up with Ann on that. She can assist you.